I'm Julie Ross.
And I'm Elizabeth Cohen.
And this is the Parenting Horizons podcast.
Julie Ross is a parent educator and counselor with over 30 years of experience in private practice.
Elizabeth is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience in private practice.
Perhaps most importantly, we're parents just like you.
Through conversations covering a wide range of different parenting topics, challenges, and roadblocks, we hope to give you some practical tools that might just help make parenting a little bit easier.
Nobody's perfect, and parenting is challenging, to say the least. But with a few skills under our belts, we might just be able to be good enough parents and enjoy the journey and our children a little bit more in the process. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parenting Horizons podcast. I'm Elizabeth Cohen, here with my co-host, who I am so grateful to be able to sit with and ponder really important ideas together on our podcast, Julie Ross. And I'm especially excited today, but also noticing some trepidation, as maybe some of your listeners will as well when you hear about the topic, which is that I have my dear friend Joanne DiMauro here to speak on the heels of releasing her new book, which is a beautiful memoir that she has written that is about the death and the process of dying when love remains. And I wanted her to come and talk with us, and she'll share a little bit about herself because, as I said, when we hear the word death, some of us could turn the volume down. Some of us might think, this isn't for me. I'm 27 or I'm 15. But she's here today to tell us and talk with us a little bit about how we can approach death in different ways. So I'm so happy to have you here, Joanne. And I'm hoping you could share a little bit about your history, your background, and what's brought you here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me. I mean, this is just I always appreciate opportunity to talk about grief, death, and dying
We appreciate
in a setting
that
doesn't really get discussed. So
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, nice to meet you too, Julie. So I guess I could start with my background, what brought me to this work, or my bio, a little bit of where I came from. First of all, I just want to say probably about 20 years ago, I went to a weekend conference in New York City. It was called the Art of Dying Conference, and it was a weekend long workshop. And I tell you, I never felt more alive than I felt at that conference. And all the rock stars of the thanatology world, which is the scientific study of death and dying and bereavement, were there speaking. And I think, the biggest takeaway I had from that weekend was that we are a grief illiterate, death phobic society. Nobody wants to talk about death. Nobody wants to talk about dying. And the reality is that, we suffer losses our whole life. We lose whatever, friendships, homes, marriages, aging, everything, you name it. And we don't look at that as something, as a death. We sort of wait until the big death, somebody near and dear to us dies, or our own mortality. And then we start exploring the concept of what grief and death and dying is. So anyway, that's how I got started. I got jazzed about it. And then I went back to my life, and I was a performing artist. I worked in show business. I did lots of things there. I was a rockette. I was a Fosse dancer and an actress. And then I went, and it kind of was a natural progression from performing arts into the healing arts. And as a healing artist, I worked as a health coach, helping people with lifestyle, food, diet, and lifestyle. Coaching. I did medical fitness training, which I still do. I work with seniors, post rehab, and chronic disease management. And I got Reiki certified, which is a form of energy healing. Oh my God, so many things. I'm a novice homeopath and herbalist because I'm really interested in natural health and healing. I always have been. So I like to apply that to my, I've got all these tools in my toolbox, and I apply those to work with my clients. And now what happened was in 2018, my brother, my beloved brother,
Wow.
younger brother, got sick with a terminal illness. And I think it's just, I was on my knees at that point. All the tools I had in my toolbox, it
Hmm.
seemed like nothing was working. I didn't know how to, crawl myself out of this deep grief. And I started writing. I was in support groups, but I started writing. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd get up and I'd start writing about whatever was coming up for me. And then that sort of spurred me on to, I went to a grief writing through loss and
Wow.
trauma workshop with David Kessler, who I actually had met 20 years ago at that Death and Dying Institute. And I was writing. It was encouraged me to write, and that was very cathartic way for me to explore the concepts around death and dying and my own grief. And then I completed my book, and then I went on to David's grief educator certification course. It just seemed like a natural progression for me, and also working with people, older people. It seemed like a natural step to how do I help people with end of life, and also, I just feel like now I get really jazzed about grief education because I feel like it's something like the one thing they said is that
Yeah.
the fact that we are grief illiterate, that getting skilled in grief, it's a necessity. And I was like, well, okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, we all mourn our losses, but the skillfulness of grief comes, it's not about, getting through the grief or getting to the other side. It's about how do we, not becoming more of a productive human being once we're on the other side? No, it's about
Right.
understanding grief, that there is no other side. I mean, it's part of the
Mm,
human experience. So I was like, okay, this is something I really want to help. I don't know, it's culture changing conversations, I think, to,
yeah.
get people to talk about grief and way before somebody starts to get sick and die. And I think that came up for me and my brother dealing with my own grief with my brother's sickness
Mm.
and death, is that it triggered all these other griefs and losses that I had
Mm.
stuffed and
Wow.
buried in myself. And I was like, oh, it's almost like I felt like my brother got sick so I could get well. And
Oh,
I started unpackaging and uncovering my own repressed feelings around grief. And,
yeah.
and grief is it's just the change that we don't want. And it happens all the time. So,
Yeah.
how do we get ahead of that and start talking about it? And you two being, therapists, I mean, how lucky are your kids to have, therapists as
Right.
parents? Because I
Yeah.
think most people, don't know how to talk about endings, loss, death for their kids. And
Absolutely.
then all you do is you may feel your kids, you don't want them to suffer
Right.
their loss. And the reality is like it's part of the human experience, it's part of the whole package. The more they
Yep.
can drop into and have their losses being
Right.
witnessed and share about it, the more they
Yeah.
can feel their joy. I truly believe that. I mean,
Yeah.
I felt that in my own experience. So
Hmm. Well, Joanne, there's so much that you said that I'm sure Julie wants to ask about too. The thing that really stuck out to me were some words you were using that are
mm,
never associated
Yeah.
with
Right.
death. Jazzed, skillful, joy,
hmm
healing, right? You are bringing this other, it feels like Julie and I were just talking about the power of from darkness to light. It's like you're bringing in the light part of darkness. And look at our earth, right? We can't,
Mm-hmm.
none of the animals, plants would be able
Right.
to survive if we didn't have darkness and night. We need darkness for the day. And so
exactly.
as bringing these words to what is, people find unspeakable
hmm
is so important, and so
yeah.
essential. And I guess I want to say to our listeners too that my experience has been that the only people who are okay talking about death are
Mm-hmm.
people who have like strict dogma religion, so they kind of
hmm
know what's happening with
Right.
death. But this is not about having to, what Joanne's talking about is not having even have any faith. You don't have to have faith for this. This is just about
hmm
having a conversation about what's real,
Right.
as
I think
opposed
that's
to just talking about like only one part, like only talking about the day and pretending there's no night kind of thing. Is that right,
Right,
Joanne?
right. Yeah, absolutely. I just feel like, it's uh it's part of the human experience. Just, death, dying, grief, it's all part of us being alive and being human. And I think the more like we don't recognize what grief, I'll talk about grief, what grief is until we experience it, and then we're afraid of it. I think that's it. We're afraid of grief. We're afraid to have these conversations. And the fact that we lose things our whole life. I don't know. I just feel it's important for us to change the discourse around these fearful topics, and I'm hoping that it'll
sure.
make it. Yeah. Okay. This is where I'm getting a little stumbling. I might want to
I
stop.
was just going to say, in my practice, um, parents are so afraid to talk about death with their children, and and I don't really know why exactly, um, because I do talk. When my children were little, we did talk about death. It was
Hmm.
kind of just part of our conversations, because there's seasons, right? I mean, if we look at nature, things die and then they come back. The trees have to shed their leaves, and then
Hmm.
and then they're born again, basically. um and I'm thinking about, I think there's some children's book authors like Margaret Wise Brown, who wrote The Dead Bird, which puts it front and center. Or I don't remember the author's name, but The 10th Good Thing About Barney, and Barney's not the dinosaur, Barney is a cat, in the book. And I think they've done a good job pulling it, to front and center. But I find that parents are even afraid to own those books or to investigate those books to try to talk to their kids about this.
Yeah. I think this is an issue that we talk about a lot, Julie,
Right.
in our podcast, which is, of course, the parents don't want their books. They had no parents talking to them about grief. Like the parents don't know
Right.
how to talk about death or dying or grief. And as Joanne said, there's so many griefs. Like, how many stories have you
Yes.
heard about, someone coming home and not finding out till later that their dog had died? I mean, I hear this all
Hmm.
the time, these really
Yeah.
painful where
Yeah.
parents were trying to protect them, and I think really thought that
Yeah.
was better to protect them from the truth. But I think, I mean, Joanne, can you share a little bit about what the value is of actually talking about it versus pretending it's not happening? Like, how does that help someone move through a difficult experience?
Yeah. I think, especially talking to your kids about it, like, giving them space to ask questions is really important, and feeling okay that you don't know the answers. I think that's important for um, just families in general, because kids are always looking to you for all the answers, and if you don't know the answers, well, that space of ambiguity, it's okay that you don't know the answers. And also I think it's important to maybe, as parents or just people in general, we don't want our loved ones to feel pain. And I think I was just thinking about, my girlfriend was telling me about, like you said, Elizabeth, that your parents didn't know how to talk about it. So I think we're another generation where we're starting to look and explore how to talk about death and dying and grief with our kids. And my girlfriend was sharing with me about when she was a kid, she didn't make the cheerleading team. And she was devastated and had a lot of sadness and grief around it. And her mom was very supportive and wanted, felt so sad for her and was really upset as well. And then, weeks went by, and my friend was like, I was actually fine with it. I'd already moved on, but my mom was still like so upset about it. And she said, I had to say to my mom, like, I'm already over that. But what happens is because adults don't necessarily know about grief or loss or how to even experience it, that it it gets mixed up. Like their own losses bump up against their kids' loss. So then they can't identify like, oh, wait, this is my grief. This is my loss. It's not my child's. So I think the more we learn, we get comfortable with grief, and then we will be able to designate and decipher like, oh, wait, and it's okay, to have space for both.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you're going to feel loss for your kid, but you're also going to be like, okay, wait, that's my stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a learning curve there, but I just think it's just so important to
Yeah.
have these conversations and hold space and let your kid just have their feelings around it, or have your family or friends have their feelings around it. And that's really all we can do, because grief needs to be witnessed, it needs to be shared. And it's when we hold it and suppress it is where I think we get into trouble.
Right.
We can get sick. It can come out later, and then it becomes compounded grief. Like what I
Mm.
said, what I experienced with my brother, having my grief over his death and his dying. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, in touch with all these other griefs that I had been suppressing all these years, and how, unhealthy that was for me. So, man, let's get ahead of it, with the kids.
Did you have the experience where not having acknowledged your grief made you physically ill?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Many times. Yes. Holding that
Mm.
whole, the healing, they always say the healing is in the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
It's, the issues are in the tissues. It's when we're holding that we suppress, it's really blocked energy. So we
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to get in touch with that energy, release it. There's that 90-second rule too. This is just another aside. They say it takes 90 seconds for you to actually feel your feelings. People think they're feeling their feelings, but they're talking about their feelings. They're in their head. They're like, I feel sad, I feel angry, but they're actually not having that feeling. So I think it's a practice of
Yeah.
stopping, breathing, maybe find where in your body you might be holding that, like a tension or a tightness, and then just sit with that and breathe into that. And you'd be, amazed or be surprised what comes up. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
tears, maybe it's laughter, some kind of release. So I just think it's so healthy to not
Yeah.
suppress, hold.
And
Yeah.
you said the most important thing for grief is to share and to be witnessed. And as
Mm-hmm.
parents, we are perfectly set up for that role. Julie and I talk about being curious all the time on
Mm-hmm.
this podcast, to just not assume, also like with your girlfriend, not to assume that she's still upset about it. Ask her, how are you feeling about
Right.
cheerleading? How
Yeah.
did it go today? I know it was the
Mm-hmm.
first cheerleading class, to bring this sense of curiosity. And I think it's so important. I know we've talked about this before, that um, when someone passes, and or there's a loss, so many good intended people don't want to bring it up, because the
Mm-hmm.
person, they don't want to upset them more. But if you talk to anyone
Right.
who has lost someone, they will
Right.
say the number one thing I
Yeah.
want is for someone to ask me about the person or the thing that I lost, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Is to ask them. And, they're, even though they're a spouse is passed, they're still a spouse, or their child has died, they are still a mother,
Yeah.
they're still a mother to two children. One's alive, one's passed away. But yeah, talk about their child. Ask them
Yeah.
about their child. What would their child, name their child? Use their name, I think, is important. And I think, Elizabeth, you said,
Yeah, I have a client I'm working with, who's went through a very traumatic grief of her husband, and so often was feeling so overwhelmed, and I would say, "What would Joe do?" That's not his real name,
mm,
but I would say, "What would Joe say?" And if Joe was here, and Joe is here with us, uh, and I noticed with her, and I noticed also with you, Joanne, when I ask about your lost person, there is a lit upness that happens. It is not sad. It is actually
mhm,
joyful. And what a
yes.
gift to be able to give to someone else. So for parents to also think about that. If your kid has lost somebody, it will bring them joy to be able to talk about that loss. It won't just bring them
Hmm.
sadness. Don't you think, Julie, that's probably why people don't want to talk about it? They're worried it's going to hurt the kid.
Right, exactly. I
Mm,
think that's correct. I think that they're worried that they think, oh, I think my kid has moved past this. So I don't want
Mm,
to bring it back up and, create all that
mm,
raw feeling. But the kid hasn't moved past it. The kid has just suppressed it. And,
mhm,
and they need to talk about it. Being able to verbalize your memories about someone keeps that person alive, or your memories about
mm,
an animal or whatever, keeps that person alive and keeps that person close, so that you don't feel like you've lost them. You've lost their physicality, but you haven't lost
mhm.
all of the joy and memories that you have with them.
Right. And it's making me
Absolutely.
think developmentally. Um, it's interesting. It's reminding me in my divorce work, which is another loss. I talk about
Mhm,
how it's one of the real problems when parents talk negatively about the other parent is that they're indirectly the kids are going to feel as if they're talking about a part of them. And I was just thinking about your example, Julie, like if we don't talk about the pet, let's say, then who the kid was with the pet, the
Right.
kid's love of the pet, right? The kid's frustration with that whole part, if you want to call it, of the kid kind of goes away and disappears. And so
Yeah.
that narrative, it's like
mhm.
in some ways you're denying your kid's existence around that loss.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. I also think when a family experiences a loss, the loss of a grandparent, let's say. So that's, my parent, my children's grandparent, if they have children, it's their great grandparent. I think one of the things that happens, and this is one of the things that I learned when I lost my parents, was that it was okay for me to show my grief to my children,
Mm,
that they wouldn't think of me as being weak, but that I would be able to model how we
yeah.
handle the big emotions that are associated with loss. And I think a lot of
Mm,
parents don't recognize that or understand how important it is
mhm.
for you to have for children to have that modeling take place for them.
Yes, very powerful, and it's so true, and it's the thing, people experience grief in a different way. There is no one right way or wrong way to grieve, and, I think just us getting more familiar with it, what it looks like. It can look like a million things, like you said,
Hmm.
Julie. It could be, you could be mourning your mother and in a lot of tears, and maybe your daughter doesn't have that
Right.
experience, or maybe your husband or your sister is a practical griever. I think that happened in my family. My sister is considered a practical griever, which is basically she mourned my mother, was around the funeral and all that, was grieving, and then shortly after it was had moved on, and
Hmm.
that's perfectly fine. That's just, everybody, like I said, grieves differently, so
Right.
and also depends on the relationship that you had.
Hmm.
And when you were talking about earlier about Elizabeth, about, uh, what you were saying about allowing, that you have joy around having those memories. I think that's what happens when we allow space to talk about our loved one or thing that's passed. We can our grief evolves versus like constantly revolving around the loss. It evolves into more love, and you have these memories, and you have a different experience with the memories. Like at first, oh, I can't go by that church or that place or that playground that we used to go to, and then as you evolve in your grief, it brings back good memories and joy, and you remember like funny things that you experienced with your loved one. So
Yeah, the word integration is coming up for me of just, we need to integrate all parts of this human experience, as you said in the beginning, Joanne. And if
mhm,
we have anything that we are disavowing and disowning, in this circumstance, we're talking about death, our life is less abundant and less full and less
Mhm.
right, less integrated. And so I know this is hard for listeners. Like, I don't want to pretend that this is easy. I mean, it's
Right.
hard because, unlike Joanne, there's very few people out there talking about this, making it comfortable. Think about where we see grief in movies when people are wailing over a coffin,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
I mean, or I don't know, that's all I can think of. Like wailing and not getting over it. Like, I don't know, a funny movie about dysfunctional families maybe, but like, I mean, there's just one version, and then it's a little bit like the
Mhm.
fairy tales, like, and they were lived happily ever after. It's like, and they were miserable
Mhm.
forever. Like, what happens
Mhm.
after? Where's the
Right.
stories? And so we don't have that
Right.
in our lexicon, but we need to bring that in. We need to see what happens after, before, during, underneath, all of it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
um
And also what you were talking about, yeah, Elizabeth, when you're talking about that, as far as dying too is the same thing. Like, in the movies, people, are sick and then they just die,
Right.
and that's not the reality. It doesn't, dying is not pretty.
Yeah.
And I think that's a thing that people are afraid of. Like, they don't want to bring their kids in to see, grandma and grandpa on their deathbed because it's so scary and frightening to see them in those end stages of life. But I think there's a lot of people out there that are promoting and sharing with the with their clients are allowing them to show what death looks like. What does dying look like? This is the death rattle. This will happen for most people at the end. It doesn't mean that they're choking. It just means that there's liquid mucus in the throat, and it's like blowing through a bubble, a straw sound. So just simple things like that. And there's lots of information out there now. We're trying to allow people to feel safe and to feel like, oh, okay, this is what dying looks like, and be able to share that with their kids.
Mhm.
I mean, we're on the cutting edge of that, but it's happening.
Joanne, you said one of the smartest things to me, many smart things, but one thing you said to me was, imagine if nobody knew anything about birth and you had to go in
Yeah.
and give birth. Right? It's basically like we
Yeah.
take classes, we read books. How is it
Yeah.
any different? Like, we're basically
Right.
going in and don't know at all what it's going to look like. That,
Yeah.
like, we would think that was
Yeah.
bananas. But so why do we do that
Yeah.
with death? And
Yeah.
what,
I
I
know.
mean, and then it becomes more of a mystery, and then we don't know what to
Hmm.
tell our kids or how to prepare them. And I
Right.
hear that a lot. I don't want my kids to remember them that way.
Yeah.
Again, going
Mm.
back to that not integrating, right? Like,
Hmm.
as if you just stop as if you have a
Right.
choice to stop at a point in the story, right? Do you hear that too, Julie?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about, it was my privilege to be with my stepfather when he died, and
Mm.
the rest of the family was there too. But it was a privilege. It wasn't scary. It
Mhm.
wasn't, um, you know, I mean, it was horrible that he died, but it wasn't. Uh, it was a healing thing to be able to witness him. However you want to put it, Passover
Mhm.
or whatever. And I thought, that's really important. I'm also put in mind of the when my daughter was 3 or 4 years old, and there was a little girl in our building who was about 10, maybe 11 years old, named Melissa. And Melissa died very suddenly at that young age. And I'm not sure why or whatever. But we took Emily to the funeral, and it was an open casket funeral. And I let her decide whether she wanted to go see, the body. And she did. And she walked up and she said, "That's not really Melissa." And she's right.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
spirit was gone, and she understood that. That
Mm.
this was just a body, and and it gave her closure. I think it's important that we do that for kids, allow them into the process, allow them to come to the
Mhm.
funerals, allow them to come to the
Absolutely.
open caskets, to the closed caskets, to the memorials, to the graveside, whatever I wouldn't do it against a child's will, right? But I think if I think it's important to um, e- let them see that it's part of being a human being. It's part of being
Mhm.
alive. I mean, not just a human being, because
Exactly.
plants are alive, and
Ex-
you know.
Yeah, I think another thing that grief educators are doing, which I think is fabulous, is taking kids on field trips to funeral homes and graveyards. So, the first time that they see a dead person is not going to be when grandma is lying in the casket. That they can go to a funeral home and have a little tour and see what does a casket look like? Maybe they get to, climb in it, or, like,
Right.
just to have that experience and be comfortable with, like, this is you know, what it looks like. And so death won't be so scary to them when somebody near and dear to them does pass away. So I'm all for that. Field trips for kids to
Yeah.
funeral
Wow.
homes.
That's really interesting. And you bring up a really good point, Joanne, that it makes me think of as a cognitive behavioral therapist, like exposure therapy. And so
Mm.
of it
Mhm.
we have fear of the unknown. So if they don't know, then actually the whole funeral grieving will just be filled with fear, and they won't be
Mhm.
able to really feel the sadness or feel the grief. Like they can't, we actually
Right.
are keeping them by not preparing them, we're keeping them from the pure emotion that Julie described so beautifully she got to have with her stepdad, because they'll just be so
Mhm.
preoccupied with the fear,
Right.
I
Yes.
think.
Yes.
Exactly.
And I think that comes up too for like preparing for your own death or your legacy is, you know, get ahead of it. And I'm doing a lot of research on that now. There's so much out there now with environmentally conscious funerals and burials and green burials.
That's
And
what I've put
to
in
do
my
that
will.
research,
That's what I've put in my will, is to be composted, which is now happening in New York, in the New York
is
era.
it?
It's
Yeah.
now legal. Yeah. Yeah.
There's, in of course, in California, they're way ahead of us, but they do sea burials.
Oh.
Just wrap them in Muslim and drop them in the ocean, back to that's just so natural. I mean, that's where we came from. So why not go
I love
back?
it.
And I just think, getting ahead of it and planning for all that is it's not only are you doing a service for yourself to feel like, okay, I'm really completing things, but I'm also giving my loved ones and heirs room and space to have to grieve,
Yes.
because like you said, Elizabeth, like they're so caught up with the busyness of having to plan everything, and who can make those decisions at that time,
Yeah.
because they're so distraught and upset, and then they got to make hundreds of decisions about whatever burials, caskets, what are they going to do, how the memorial services. If you plan that all ahead, it gives them space and allows them to have that full experience of the loss and the
Right.
love. So
My
Yeah.
my father-in-law had a binder that was this thick. So
mhm.
I'm indicating 2 to 3 inches thick, that he
Oh yeah,
had everything planned, what songs he wanted,
terrific.
how he
Yeah.
wanted to his body to be taken care of, I mean, it was i- incredible, and it saved my um, husband and his siblings so much, um, so much sorrow, because they weren't having struggling with
Mhm.
these decisions. They were really more able to celebrate his life, because
Yes.
he'd
Yes.
figured it out, and I was like, wow, it was very him,
Mhm.
but to do something like that. But what a great thing! What a
Yeah.
great gift
Mm.
to give to your
Yes.
Absolutely.
kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom did that too, which, it gave us exactly what you said, Julie. Gave us a lot of space to grieve her. I mean, there's still a million things you have to do
Oh,
at the
Right.
yes,
end, but
absolutely.
we, planned it all down to the flowers and everything. So I
Right.
really appreciate it. And, I always say, I tell people, start just in your, whatever, in your file cabinet, a death file, and just start throwing in things in there like, oh, I like that article, or that, pamphlet, or that, and just start collecting things
Yes.
so you can start preparing. And I always suggest this book, and I don't get a kickback or anything. So Please don't. It's called I'm Dead Now What? And it's a great book because it has like anything you can possibly
Oh, I
need
love
to
that.
fill out information, business affairs, your wishes, your belongings. You can just fill out this book, and that will save your loved one a lot of time and
That's
energy to
wonderful.
try to find all your, your financial stuff and whatever. So,
Right.
Oh, that's great.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. You know, as we're talking, a memory's coming back to me. And when my grandmother died and I was 6, I am pretty sure my parents thought I was too little to go to the funeral.
Mm,
I'm pretty sure that is the facts. However, I created a memory of being there. So
Wow.
mm,
I couldn't, like, there was a space that was being given to, like, this, there was this hole, it feels like, and I had to fill it in so that I could feel connected. I know that. So
mm,
that's why it's so funny to say, like, that's the fact. Like, I know that, but my body is telling you that I was there, and I grieved. And so I share this story to say to parents that, like, how desperately kids need that. Like, why would I want to imagine being in a few, my parents thought they were protecting me and me not being sad. I wanted to be sad. I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
be sad
yeah.
with them. I wanted to be sad with my grandmother's coffin, and I wanted to be in
Mm-hmm,
the ritual. And so I think, as Julie said, like, really to think about not robbing your child of an
mm-hmm,
opportunity to say goodbye, to understand life. And it's gritty and dirty and yucky, but
right.
let's not rob them of that.
Yeah.
Because, as Joanne said, will be suppressed, but they deserve that. And I just know I had to create it in my own head. That's how much I needed it.
Yeah. I also want to say to parents that, um, sometimes not only will kids create a memory if they're being deprived at the actual event, but sometimes even if they're not deprived of the event, in order to process it, they have to play it out. So my daughter, I have a picture of my daughter at age 2 years old or 3 years old or some young age. Might have been after Melissa died. And she's sitting on the floor, and she's got all of these little tykes, dolls around her like this. And I asked her, what are you doing? She said, playing funeral. She
Mm,
was just playing it.
mm,
It wasn't
yeah.
tragic. She wasn't upset. She was just, you know, figuring it out. And I think that's important too, that kids need to play out and in order to
Mm-hmm.
process what they're going through.
Yeah. And, also I was thinking sibling loss is sometimes considered disenfranchised grief, meaning that it doesn't get as much attention paid to it as, say, the parents or the children or the spouse. And, meanwhile, siblings are probably they have the closest DNA of
Right.
anybody. There's not always a lot of room for space for allowing for the feelings to come up
Hmm.
around sibling loss. So, as parents, it's good to kind of be aware of that, oh, wow, you're going through the loss and it's devastating because you've lost your child, but your other child is having their experience, which is really profound and often neglected and not really paid attention to or overlooked
Right.
their experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting such an important piece about when a tragedy hit, like, or a loss hits a family system,
Hmm.
Mhm.
right? There's the individual, just like anything in a system, there's the individual responses, and then there's the system responses.
Hmm.
And how, important it is to go back to what you said about sharing and witnessing. Like, just
Mhm.
keep having, like, this feeling of, it has to be so clear. There has to be, like, a clear flow of all the feelings.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the gunkiness, just, there's so
Yes.
many
Yeah.
there's so many spots between the parents, between the siblings, there's so many spots where it can get stuck. And so,
Mhm.
I really hope that parents, and I want to say, like, are brave enough, because it's hard,
Mm-hmm.
It
to
is.
sit with it rather than avoid it. Yeah.
Right. And it's not saying that it's going to be any less painful, but I think, we'll start to, if we still keep having these conversations about grief and death and dying and be mainstream it a little more, we'll be more familiar with it. So when it comes up around a loss or a death, or we'll be able to talk about it. And like you said, with birth, like we know, have all this information about birth. It doesn't mean somebody going through having a child for the first time, they're still scared.
Right.
but
Exactly.
but they know, they have the information. Oh, okay, this is what's happened with
Right.
millions
Yeah.
and millions of people. So I think it's the same with death and dying.
Yeah.
Like we'll still be frightened of it. I mean, it's not maybe going to be
Right.
any less fearful, but we'll know death. We'll know it. We'll have the information. We'll know what it looks like.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's just so important.
Mm-hmm.
Changing our culture.
Yeah, it makes me think about, I think this is a Buddhist concept, but I'm not exactly sure, about the second arrow. I don't know if you know, Joanne, but essentially that
Mm.
we have a feeling, like we have grief and we have the sadness. And then the second, it's like, don't give yourself the second arrow. So you get pierced by one arrow, which is the loss and the grief, and then the judgment about the grief or the
Oh,
suppression
sure.
of the
Yeah.
grief. It's like what you do
Yeah.
to the feeling instead of just having the pure
Yes.
feeling,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's what you're saying, Joanne, is like, we're not saying that by feeling it, it's going to feel good. It's just not going to
Mm-hmm.
add an extra layer of what we call complicated grief or
Right.
unprocessed or coming out sideways. Um,
Right.
it's more pure. That's why the word pure comes to mind. It's like this,
Mm-hmm.
the real true feelings, not the feelings with something overlapping it.
Right. And there's a lot of shame that's put on. I think of shame comes up for me because society maybe doesn't recognize that. I'm just talking about other losses like a divorce or a death of a divorced spouse. And it's not, it's kind of out of societal norms that you would grieve that. So there's some shame, or even, uh, suicide, or, I don't, it's trauma. But so we don't feel like we can actually have that much grief, or society won't accept us having that much grief around that. So I think the shame gets on top of the feelings of the grief. So it's another form of suppression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to go back to something you said earlier, I think, Joanne, which is that ev- everybody grieves differently, right? I
Hmm.
mean, we understand that grief is a process and it has these steps, outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, denial and blah, 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 blah.
Yes.
But everybody grieves differently. And just like you were talking about your sister, I think it was the practical
Mm.
griever, right?
Right.
That's one way of grieving. Um,
Hmm.
I think there are also people for whom their childhood was traumatic in terms of, let's say, a parent, and the parent dies, and they don't grieve at that point. They've already grieved a lot of the time, because of what they
Mm.
didn't have, what they wish they'd had.
Sure.
And, so I want to make sure that our listeners understand that if they, did lose someone who is quote unquote supposed to be significant in their lives, and they didn't grieve, it's not always repression. It's sometimes it's that person was
Hmm.
a really bad
Right.
person.
Sure.
Yeah, I appreciate your saying that. I was thinking about that, Julie, when we talked about having your kids watch you,
Mhm.
because I had a situation like that where I had grieved for a long time the loss of someone,
Right.
and then they died, and I had to talk with my kids about that too. Like,
Yes.
my
Yeah.
sister was having a different experience than me, so why are you in this circumstance? And so
Right.
even I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think that's a whole other stigma. I mean, there's a stigma of like, it's like anything in this world we live in. Like, don't grieve too much, but you got to grieve a little bit,
Yeah.
right? Like, you have to be in this perfect middle. I don't know what that is. Again, movies or something,
Yeah.
right? God forbid you don't grieve at all, you know?
Yeah.
Or,
What's wrong with her? Yeah.
right. Like, exactly. Like when I've talked to people who, about getting divorced, and when people say, I'm so sorry, and you say, no, it's good. And the people are so shocked by that, for some people, as you're saying, Julie, the loss of a person in their life helps them.
Yes.
Whether,
Yeah.
right. And so I think it's really important to say that we also can't assume what someone's grief is. So to be
Right.
curious, what's this
Exactly.
been like
Yes.
for you?
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
And one tip I just want to share out there, because this happens a lot. It's similar to the divorce situation, which is that we're so uncomfortable with death, whether it's a person or an animal. A friend of mine who just lost her cat, everyone's first question was, how old's the cat?
I know.
As if she said it was 15, she's not grieving. Or, well, was he sick? My partner died. Were they sick? Please don't ask those questions. Don't ask how old the pet was, and don't ask if they were sick. It doesn't change the story at all. It's I know it's because it's uncomfortable. That's what people do. But it's kind of like those questions, like, don't ask anyone if they want to have children. Like, here's some questions to come up. So those are the death and dying questions I'd like to suggest, because it minimizes the person's
Minimizes
experience.
their grief. Right.
Exactly.
And everybody's grief is personal to them.
Yes.
So you can't compare griefs.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Joanne, I'm curious, how do you have any suggestions of appropriate ways to respond when somebody shares that they've had a loss of some kind? As opposed to, Elizabeth just said, please don't say this. I mean, how can people start to get more comfortable with this? Obviously, so that their questions or responses can be more organic. But are there any kind of little scripted things to lead them into that ability to be more comfortable with death?
Yeah, I think it's just coming from your heart and starting with asking the person how they're feeling and their grief today. How is your grief today? It's so important because, sometimes there are people that are in grief, they're having a quote unquote good day and they're not feeling heavy or down that day. And that's perfectly normal too. So, how is your grief today? And then ask them about, I think you said it earlier, Elizabeth, ask them about that person. Can you tell me, do you want to talk about him? Do you want to talk about her? I always think it's important to know when the person died, because if it's been, several years, then that's maybe a different situation. They may need, some outside help. But if it's recent, then I think that they, ask them if they want to talk about their loved one. And
I like
usually
that.
they do. It's surprising how people want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, like you said, avoid talking about it because they just want to kind of scoot around it and, make conversation about the food or whatever. And they don't really want to allow space for the person to share. And I noticed that I went to a friend who lost his wife, who had been sick for a while. And he had a big memorial service at his apartment. And there's tons of people there, tons of food. And I showed up and I went to him and I said, how are you feeling? I mean, that's just basic. How are you feeling today? And he just was able to, or wanted to share about that. And he talked about Lily, his wife, and I talked about her. I had some good memories about her and I shared those with him, and then he shared some good memories about it. So I think, we talked about her, and it was like we had our own little memorial to her in a good loving way, and I feel like it was helpful.
Yeah.
I found it helpful for myself, and also I found wanting to talk about her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love
Well,
that.
that's the thing. You're meeting I love your example of like looking at the food, and people can't see you, but you were doing this kind of circular motion with your body. It's like staying away from the thing that we don't want to talk about, that is the only thing that other person is thinking about. And so it's like witnessing where they are and not hoping they're not there.
Right.
It's interesting because, in the Jewish tradition, which is how I was brought up, we have 7 days of mourning of the Shiva, and you're supposed to tell stories of the person. And I remember,
beautiful tradition.
Yeah, you would just tell stories, and pretty joyful. And the idea was also that people would bring food, like you wouldn't be alone for those first 7 days. You would be kind of held. And I remember as a kid thinking, wow, the mourners are laughing and they're telling stories, and they were so joyful. And I think that's the other piece, again, going back to the one image we have. We don't get to see that too, the joy of being able to remember the gift of having somebody, because there's a lot of gratitude that comes also when in losing someone. In what you had with them. So I think it's meeting that discomfort, meeting that moment, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that person, could very well also, the person that loses someone, there's a real phenomenon called grief brain. And what that is that your brain, it takes a while to reroute and re-register and adapt to the person in your life not being there. So that can happen like you go to a party and, it's maybe been months or years since the person's died, and your brain, depending on how long it takes for you to adapt, recognizes the space where that person normally would be, and maybe the rest of the people in the party don't recognize it, and you're having all these reactions, and it's very real. Like your brain needs to adjust and adapt. There's all kinds of research done on this now, and it's a very real thing. So like when you feel like, oh man, I'm suffering from brain fog, or I can't think straight, that's very physical, and it is your brain adjusting to that person or thing being gone.
Wow. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, you've covered so many important topics today, and really, I think I can speak for myself, stretched the audience. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you didn't get to share that you'd like to share, if there's any last few tidbits before we finish up for our community.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say that I think these conversations and mainstreaming or raising grief literacy is actually a way to change the world, because I think once we become more familiar with grief and recognize it and know it and can name it, then we start to have compassion for ourselves, and then therefore we have more compassion for other people. So we become more loving as a species, and how could that not help change the world?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree too.
Yeah.
What a hopeful piece to end on, which all those kinds of messages can be found in Joanne's book, What Remains is Love. And thank you so much for coming and talking about this very tender topic.
We really appreciate it. Thank you. You've been listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast. If you would like to reach Elizabeth Cohen, you can go to www.centerforcbtinnyc.com.
And if you'd like to reach Julie Ross, please go to www.parentinghorizons.com.